My name is Kinsley Sinclair. I was 34 years old on that quiet morning when my family drove 3 hours to sell a ranch they didn't even know I already owned. To really understand how we got to that day, you have to go back 9 years. You have to go back to the morning of my 25th birthday, to a phone call I've been half expecting and wholly dreading, and to the moment I finally stopped waiting for people to love me the way I deserved to be loved. IT started, as so many things in my life did, with my mother's voice on the other end of the telephone line. She was calling to tell me, once again, that they wouldn't be coming to see me. That was a whole message, delivered with the calm certainty of someone announcing the weather. No apology wrapped around it. No real explanation tucked underneath it. Just a plain and familiar fact of my absence from their plans. I was always the strong one in the family. You see, my sister Sloane was the one they believed needed all their time, all their energy, all their showing up. On that birthday, standing in my small rented room with the phone pressed against my ear, I finally saw the truth of it. Not the version of the truth I had been telling myself for years. The gentle story where they meant well and just got distracted, but the real and unvarnished version. The one that said this was not an accident. This was a choice they made every single day. And they made it easily, and they would keep making it for as long as I let them so I packed a small bag. I didn't take much. Just 2 pairs of jeans, my boots, and a small box of cash I had been saving for what I told myself was an emergency. I suppose I had always known, somewhere underneath everything, that the emergency would eventually arrive. I got in my car and I left. What I did that morning, and the 8 years I spent afterward fixing up a broken-down ranch 3 hours away from anyone with my last name, is something none of them ever saw coming. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand the ending, you need to understand the beginning. And the beginning is a kitchen, and a girl who was told her whole life that her feelings were the least important ones in the room. These days, my mornings start at 4:30 in the morning. It is still completely dark outside when my eyes open. I can see the frost sitting on the fence rails when I look out the window, and I can already hear the 40 horses waiting for me, shifting in their stalls, blowing warm air into the cold. I run a boarding and training facility on 200 acres of land that I own outright, with my name on the deed and my hands in the soil. There's a rescue section in the back corner of the property where horses that have been neglected or abandoned come to recover. And right now there are 11 people on a waiting list just hoping to get a spot here. When people drive past my sign out on the main road, they usually assume I inherited all of this from a wealthy relative, that someone handed it to me with a bow on top. That assumption used to bother me. Now it just makes me smile, because the truth is so much more complicated and so much more mine. I built this with my own 2 hands, a truck I had to borrow from a neighbor in those early days, and a kind of stubbornness that the people who knew me back then would probably describe as frightening. That MY helper Casey is only 19 years old. She showed up on my doorstep 2 years ago looking for work, and she turned out to be one of the most naturally gifted people with horses I have ever encountered. She is already better at calming down a nervous young horse than I was when I was 30, and I was not bad at 30. She arrived that particular morning with 2 warm coffees, and a question about one of the horses in the second barn who'd been showing signs of a stomach ache through the night. I set down my coffee, went to check on him, walked him around the small paddock for a bit, watched how he moved and how he breathed, and told her he would feel just fine by lunchtime. He did. Then I went back to the tack room, reached up to the hook on the wall, and took down my grandfather's old work gloves. They are made of brown leather that is cracked with age, but the knuckles are worn soft from years of use. I put them on every single morning. They do not actually fit my hands particularly well. They were made for larger hands than mine, but I keep wearing them anyway because there's a whole lifetime of stories folded into that leather, and I am not ready to let go of any of them 0.8 years ago. I didn't have any of this. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. 8 years ago, all I had was a bag of clothes, a little bit of gas in my car, and my mother's voice stuck on a loop inside my head. She always said, "You're the strong one," and she said the way someone says a thing they believe is a compliment. I used to think it meant I was loved in a particular and special way, that being strong was a gift they recognized in me and admired. It took me most of my 20s to understand that it meant nothing of the sort. It just meant I was the one they expected to need less, to ask for less, to be satisfied with less, and to smile while doing it. Let me take you back to the kitchen where I first learned that lesson, because you can't understand a person without understanding the house where they were shaped. Back then, I lived in a small rented room on the other side of town from my family. I worked at a farm supply store, stacking feed bags and helping people find the right kind of fencing wire, and I was saving every penny I could toward veterinary school. I had always loved animals. From the time I was small, I understood them in a way that I never quite understood people. Animals are honest. They tell you exactly how they feel, and they don't change their story depending on who is in the room. I found that quality deeply restful. My family lived just 3 exits up the highway in the house where I grew up, a house my mother ran the way a hospital waiting room gets run, with an air of constant low-grade crisis and an unspoken understanding of who the most important patient was. At M.Y. Mother Sharon was a capable woman in many ways. She kept a clean house, and she always had food on the table, and she loved her children in whatever way she understood love to mean. The problem was not that she was cruel. Cruel would almost have been easier to name and push away from. The problem was that she had decided, somewhere early on, that Sloan needed more than I did, and she had built the entire architecture of our family around that decision without ever once asking me if it was true. My father, Wade, was a quieter kind of problem. He wanted peace above everything else, which many agreed with whoever happened to be speaking, and whoever was speaking was almost always my mother. He was not a bad man. He was just a man who had chosen comfort over courage so many times that he no longer knew there had ever been a choice to make. Sloan is 2 years younger than me, and she had a talent I did not fully appreciate until I was old enough to name it. She could take any ordinary situation and transform it into an emergency that required everyone to stop what they were doing immediately. A bad date did not end the way bad dates end for most people. For Sloan, a bad date became a catastrophe that required phone calls and reassurance, and my mother sitting at her bedside for 2 hours. A parking ticket was not an inconvenience. It was a disaster, a personal attack, evidence that the world was conspiring against her in ways that only she could feel. I learned the rhythm of these emergencies the way farmers learn to read the sky before a storm. When the air in our mother's kitchen got a particular kind of heavy, when voices got a certain kind of urgent, you knew that someone's plans were about to be canceled. And it was never going to be Sloan's plans that got canceled. It was always mine. I tried to talk about it once. I picked my moment carefully. A quiet Tuesday afternoon when my mother was cooking and Sloan was out and my father was watching television in the other room. I sat down at the kitchen table and I told my mother, as gently as I knew how, that it sometimes felt like there was only ever enough room in the family for one of us to have feelings at a time, and that the one of us who got to have feelings was never me. My mother did not stop stirring whatever was in the pot. She did not turn around to look at me. She said, "Sloan is more delicate. Honey, you know that." And the conversation was over. I did know it. I had been told it my whole life. What I was only beginning to understand was that it had stopped being a description and had become a rule, and the rule was that my feelings were inconvenient and Sloan's feelings were emergencies, and that was simply the way things were. The clearest example I can give you is my college graduation. I had worked nights for 2 years to complete my degree in animal science while still working at the farm supply store during the day. I was the first person in my entire family to finish any kind of schooling after high school, and I had done it without any help from anyone. The ceremony was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and I had let my family know about it months in advance. I had given them the exact time and the exact location, and asked them very specifically to be there. At 9:15 that morning, Sloan called our mother from the parking lot of the venue to say that she had fainted. By the time the paramedics arrived, confirmed she was fine, and left, my family was clustered around Sloan's car in the parking lot. I walked across that stage alone. I looked out at the audience of several hundred people, scanning face after face for someone who knew my name, and there was no one. They arrived for the last 10 minutes of the ceremony, after my name had already been called, after I'd already walked, after the moment had already passed that night, before she had taken a single photograph of me in my graduation cap. My mother posted a photo of Sloan resting in her car to the family's group chat with a caption about what a scary morning it had been. The notifications came in fast. I counted 41 messages in that thread about Sloan's fainting episode. There were 2 messages about my college degree, and both of them were just a thumbs-up image. The kind of response you give to a message that says the package has been delivered or the meeting has been rescheduled. I stopped watching the notifications. After that, I didn't leave the group chat, though. I stayed in it, reading along without responding. The way you keep your hand close to a hot stove even after it has burned you, because some part of you still needs to know exactly how hot it can get. People ask why people in situations like mine don't leave sooner. I have thought about this question for years, and I think the answer is this. You keep waiting for the day they finally see you. You are absolutely certain that the day is coming. You have a mental list of every moment they almost cared, every time the warmth was almost there, almost enough. And every one of those almost moments is a small hook, and together the hooks add up to something you can't easily pull yourself free from. You tell yourself that you have invested too much to walk away now. You tell yourself that leaving would prove them right, that you are not strong enough, that you are not reasonable enough, that you are the dramatic one after all. You stay because staying is what you have always done, and because you have not yet learned that staying is a choice, and choices can be changed. When I turned 25, I decided I was going to do something right. I was going to plan a birthday dinner that was so carefully organized, so thoughtfully arranged, so impossible to misinterpret, that nothing could go wrong. I booked a private room at a steakhouse in town. I paid the $100 deposit with my own money. I reserved 8 seats. I didn't ask anyone for help with the planning or the money. All I asked was for my family to show up on a Saturday at 7 in the evening, which seemed to me like an extraordinarily modest request. I didn't even trust a text message. I drove to their house on a Tuesday, in person, specifically to tell them face-to-face, so that there could be no misunderstanding and no pretending the message had been missed. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table when I arrived, going through a stack of envelopes. I recognized them immediately. She was paying Sloane's bills, sorting through them and writing checks in her careful handwriting. I stood in the kitchen I had grown up in and told her about the dinner, gave her the name of the restaurant and the time and the date. She nodded in the way she nodded when a neighbor mentioned an upcoming road closure, polite and present but not really affected. My father, from the living room, said it sounded nice, because I knew how these things could go, because I had been learning the patterns of this family for 25 years. I asked one more question. I asked my mother directly, "Is there anything happening on Saturday that I should know about?" She put her pen down. She looked at me with an expression that was almost sympathetic and said, "We can only show up for one of you at a time. Kinsley, you understand that?" I said yes, I understood. I didn't understand at all, but I had learned a long time ago that saying I didn't understand only made things harder, without making them better. I drove home feeling cautiously optimistic. The $100 deposit felt like proof that the dinner was real, that it was locked in, that this time the evening would happen the way I needed it to happen. I let myself picture it. The 8 chairs, the birthday cake I was going to order, my mother looking at me across the table with something that looked like pride. I should have known better. I had been watching this family's patterns long enough to know that the rules always change right when you think you have finally learned them. The first sign came on Thursday evening. Sloane posted in the family group chat that she was feeling off and scared. My mother replied in less than 2 minutes. I noted the time because I could not help comparing it to the average time it took my mother to respond to my messages, which was usually somewhere between several hours and never. By Friday, the feeling off had metastasized into something much larger. Sloane's boyfriend had proposed. She was engaged. They were celebrating. And because they were celebrating, there would be an engagement dinner on Saturday evening at 7 o'clock, which was, of course, the exact same time as my birthday dinner. At the exact same restaurant, I did not yell. I did not write an angry message in the group chat. I called Sloane directly. I told her, calmly and without any accusation in my voice, "Sloane, that's the same time as my birthday dinner. You know that." She used a soft, slightly helpless voice that she kept ready for situations like this one, and said she hadn't realized. She suggested that we could simply combine the 2 events, merge them together, fold my 25th birthday quietly under the larger and more exciting occasion of her engagement. I told her no. Then I called my mother. I pointed out the obvious and easy solution. Same restaurant. completely willing to celebrate Sloane's engagement, but on a different night. There were 6 other nights in the week. There were dozens of other nights in the month. My mother listened to me finish and then said the sentence that told me the decision had already been made before I even called. She said, "Sloane is in a very fragile place right now. Can't you be flexible? You're so good at that." There it was. Flexible was just another word for the one who gives everything up. I had been flexible my entire life. And what had bought me was a spot at a table where my chair kept disappearing. I sat on my bed after I hung up the phone, and I did something I had never done before. Instead of feeling sad or hurt or confused, I just did the math. I went back through every canceled plan, every unanswered message, every event where I had stood alone and waited for someone to notice. I added it all up, and what I found at the bottom of that arithmetic was not grief. It was clarity. I understood, for the first time with complete certainty, that Saturday's collision was not a mistake. It was not carelessness. It was a pattern as old as I was, and it was never going to change unless I changed something first. The only way to stop losing was to stop playing the game by their rules. On Saturday at noon, my mother called. She said, "Honey, we're doing Sloane's party tonight. We knew you'd be okay with it. We'll celebrate you some other time. I promise." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, and I asked her one question. I asked her, "Why is it always me, Mom?" She answered without hesitation, without cruelty, without any apparent awareness of what she was saying. She said, "You're the strong one, Kinsley. Sloane's the one who needs us." 11 words. That was the whole explanation. That was the sentence my entire life had been organized around. I said okay, but it was a different kind of okay than any I had said before. It was the okay of someone who has finally decided something. I called the restaurant and canceled the reservation and told them to keep the deposit. I went to my closet and packed a bag. I didn't have a detailed plan. I just had a direction. 3 hours to the east, there was a man who had never once in 25 years canceled on me, who had never told me I needed to be flexible or that someone else needed more, who had never put my feelings in a pile with other inconvenient things and sorted through them on his own schedule. My grandfather, Earl. My mother didn't think much of Earl. She said he was a failure because he lived alone on a dying ranch and hadn't made much of himself by whatever measurement she used for such things. I had always thought he was something else entirely, a man who was exactly who he said he was every single time you saw him. I got in my car and drove toward the only person who had ever consistently shown up for me. I called him from a gas station about halfway there. He picked up on the second ring. I asked if I could come and stay for a while. He didn't ask why, didn't ask for context or explanation or a sense of how long a while might mean. He just said the door would be unlocked and there was food on the stove. When I pulled into his gravel driveway just before midnight, what I could see in my headlights was a barn that was leaning at an angle that made me nervous, fences that were held up more by habit than by any structural integrity, and an old man sitting on the porch steps in the dark like he'd been waiting there and did not mind how long it took. He didn't rush to the car. He didn't make a production of it. He just patted the step beside him when I walked up and said, "Rough birthday, huh?" 2 words of actual acknowledgement, and something in me that had been held rigid for years finally let go. I sat down next to him and I told him everything, every last bit of it. And he listened without interrupting, without offering solutions, without once telling me to consider how hard it was for my mother. When I was done, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The land doesn't care who your mother loves. The land only cares who works it." I didn't understand the full weight of what he was telling me then. I thought it was just something old people said. I would understand it completely within a year. The next morning I woke up early and walked the property in the gray dawnlight and understood for the first time just how much trouble it was in. Earl was 71 years old. He had 6 horses who were old and gentle and underfed. The barn roof had a hole in it large enough to see the sky through. The pasture fencing was broken in at least a dozen places I could count from where I stood. He was too proud to have asked anyone for help. Too proud, especially to ask my mother, who would have turned any help she gave into a debt he would spend the rest of his life repaying. He sat with me at breakfast and laid it out plainly. He had land but no longer had the strength to work it, and I had strength but no land to work it on. He suggested we might try working together. He gave me a pair of work gloves that were too big for my hands by a full size. He told me they would fit once I had earned them. I put them on anyway. That first week, my hands bled. I had worked physically demanding jobs before, but nothing like this. I repaired fence posts. I patched the barn roof. I cleaned out stalls that had not been properly cleaned in months. I fed the horses, and I groomed them, and I learned their names and their individual personalities and their particular fears. And for the first time in my life, I discovered what it felt like to put effort into something and receive exactly what you earn from it. A fence I fixed stayed fixed. It did not collapse back down because someone else decided it was more convenient. A horse I spent time with became my friend in a simple and honest way. There was no mother standing in the middle of it, all deciding who deserved what. The work was mine, and the results were mine, and nobody could take either one away from me. One afternoon, not long after I arrived, a man from the neighboring property came over leading a horse on a rope. She was a bay mare, and she was in a terrible state. Her ribs were visible beneath her coat, each one distinct and countable. Her eyes had the flat, absent quality of an animal that has decided the world is not worth paying attention to. The neighbor said nobody wanted her, and he didn't know what to do with her. The vet he had spoken to suggested it might be more practical and more kind to put her down than to spend money trying to save her. Earl looked at her for a long moment and then looked at me. I said we probably couldn't afford to take on another animal. He said, we can't afford to leave her either. We took her. I named her June. What June taught me over the months that followed is something I could not have learned from any person I had met up to that point in my life. When a horse has been starved for a long time, you cannot simply feed her as much as she wants and expect her to recover. You have to go slowly and carefully, incrementally, rebuilding her relationship with nourishment in a way that her body can tolerate. Too much too fast can actually kill her. I would sit in her stall in the evenings, not doing anything in particular, just being present, letting her get accustomed to the idea that a human being nearby did not necessarily mean something bad was coming. Very gradually, over weeks, she began to lift her head when she heard me coming. Gradually, over months, she began to walk toward me rather than away from me. The first evening she came to gate on her own to meet me. I sat down in the mud of the paddock, and I wept in a way I had not wept in years, not from sadness, but from something that felt like recognition. I had been starving for a particular kind of love for the first 25 years of my life, sitting at a table where the food was always just out of my reach, and I had not even had a name for the hunger until I met an animal who knew exactly how it felt. I had one significant obstacle, and it was entirely internal. I did not know how to ask for help. I had spent so many years being the strong one, the capable one, the one who didn't need anything, that the act of asking for assistance had come to feel like a personal failure, a crumbling of the identity I had built my self-respect around. I would push through tasks that were beyond what one person could reasonably manage alone. I would work until my body was shaking with exhaustion, rather than call on a neighbor. One night, Earl found me in the dark trying to reset a heavy fence post by myself, jamming the bar into frozen ground over and over with muscles that had been working for 10 hours and had nothing left to give. He stood and watched me for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "You think being strong means doing it alone? That's not strength. That's just a different kind of prison." I was furious with him because I recognized immediately that he was right. The next morning I called a neighbor down the road and asked if I could borrow his tractor and maybe his help for an afternoon. He came the same day. What would have taken me a week alone took us an afternoon together. I learned something that afternoon that my family had accidentally taught me the opposite of. Asking for help is not weakness. Letting people help you is what makes you part of something. My mother had always held my self-sufficiency up like a virtue, praising my independence, reminding me that I didn't need anyone. What she was actually doing, I understood now, was using my strength as a reason and never offered me any. Over the following years, things changed steadily and then dramatically. Dell was our first real customer, a woman who kept 2 horses, and had heard from someone on a neighboring property that we were doing good work. She brought them to us, and she told her friends, and her friends told their friends, and the quiet word of mouth of people who take their animals seriously began to build. I was working harder than I had ever worked in my life. But the exhaustion felt entirely different from the exhaustion of working nights to pay for school while also working days to pay for food. This exhaustion had a product. You could see it in the repaired barns, in the healthy horses, in the grateful faces of people who trusted you with animals they loved. I was 26 years old with rough hands and dirty boots, and I was the happiest I had ever been. Earl had started introducing me to people as the woman who runs the place, and I had stopped correcting him. He wasn't wrong. 18 months after I left home, my mother called. I saw her name on my phone, and I felt the old pull, the one that lives in the chest somewhere beneath the rational mind, the one that says, maybe this time. But the call was not what the pull hoped it might be. She did not call to ask how I was doing, or to say that she had been thinking about me, or that she missed me, or that she was sorry. She called because Sloan was behind on her car payments, and the wedding had been called off, and she wanted to know if I could send money. I asked how she had found my number, since I had not given it to her. She said Sloan had found our ranch website online. They had not lost a daughter. They had just found a new avenue of approach. I told her no. My mother's voice shifted into something harder, and she said I was being ungrateful, that this was how I repaid everything they had done for me. I thanked her and hung up, but the call unsettled me in a way I hadn't expected. They knew where I was now. They knew the place was doing well. And my mother had asked, at the end of the conversation, how Earl's health was these days. The question was asked lightly, as a person might ask about the weather. I heard the thing underneath it. The real shape of what they were planning became clear a few years later, when my cousin Maddie, who had always been the kindest person in that branch of the family, sent me a photograph of a text message chain. My mother had started a second family group chat, one I was not part of. In it, she had written out, with some specificity, that when Earl eventually passed away, the property should be sold immediately because I had fixed it up and it was now worth significantly more than it had been. She noted that I could probably keep a horse or two if I was reasonable about things. They were sitting in a chat I was excluded from, dividing up the proceeds of 8 years of my labor, and they were doing it with the casual confidence of people who had never imagined that I might have thought to protect myself. I printed the photograph, and I brought it to Earl at the kitchen table. He read it slowly and set it down and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's my daughter, all right." Not surprised, not hurt in any visible way, just recognizing something he had always known. Then he told me something that I want to be careful about, because when someone tells you something this important, you want to get the words right. He said, "One day this place should be yours, Kinsley. You're the only one who ever bled for it." I took the words seriously. I made a 5-year plan for the business, mapped out what we needed to grow, what we needed to invest in, what our realistic capacity was, and where I wanted to be at the end of it. I reached every goal in that plan in 3 years instead of 5, by the 7th year. The ranch was something I was genuinely proud of, not in a boastful way, but in the deep and quiet way that comes from knowing exactly how much it cost you. I had staff. I had a waiting list. I had people driving significant distances to bring their horses to us because our reputation for working with difficult animals was by then well established. I had also, somewhere in the middle of all of it, fallen in love with a veterinarian named Tom, who came out to check on our horses and stayed for dinner the first time and eventually stayed for everything. He was the kind of person who showed up, not just physically but fully, with his attention and his care and his willingness to be present for both the good days and the hard ones. I had not known, until I met him, that I had been teaching myself for years what it felt like to deserve that. And then Earl's heart began to fail. It happened the way those things happen, gradually, and then suddenly, my mother, who had called approximately 3 times in 7 years, began calling everyone. She arranged a visit. She arrived with my father and with Sloan, and I watched my mother walk around the new barn with the kind of attention she had never given to anything of mine in my entire life. She ran her eyes along the fence lines and the paddock expansions and the new stable block, and I could see the calculations happening. At dinner that evening, she made gentle sounds about worrying that I was out here all alone, and whether it was sustainable, and whether I had thought about what would happen if things got harder. I smiled and said I had thought about it quite a lot. I was not alone. I had a community of people around me, real ones, people who had chosen to be here, rather than people who had simply been placed adjacent to me by biology. She didn't know what to do with that answer, so she moved on to other things. After they left, Earl asked me to come to the kitchen. He sat down at the table, the same table where I had sat with him on my first night there, and told him everything, and he put a folder in front of me. Inside was a deed. He had signed the ranch over me 3 years earlier. The land, the buildings, everything on it. It had been legally mine for 3 years already. He told me not to say anything to my mother yet. He wanted me to let her keep planning because, he said, it is easier to deal with people when you know what cards they are holding and they don't know what card you have. He said, when she finds out it was never hers to sell, you'll be standing on solid ground. I put the deed in the safe in the office, and I did not say a word to anyone in my family. The weeks that followed were among the hardest and the most important of my life. Earl was getting weaker. I spent as much time with him as I could manage while still keeping the ranch running, and my staff stepped up in ways that still move me when I think about it. Tom came every evening after his last appointment, and he and Earl would sit on the porch and talk while I finished the last round of the day's work, and I would join him as the light went down. Earl did not dramatize his dying. He faced it with the same plainness he had brought to everything else. He told me once, near the end, that the thing he was most proud of in his life was not anything he had built, but the fact that he had known, when it mattered, who deserved the thing he had to give. He told me the gloves would fit properly now. And he was right at the funeral. My family arrived with the energy of people who believe themselves to be the main characters of a story. My mother spoke to several of Earl's neighbors and friends about what a difficult time it was and how much the family was grieving, and I watched her accept condolences from people she had not spoken to in years. She pulled me aside during the reception and told me we needed to settle the family affairs, and she said in the tone of someone organizing a committee, businesslike and already past the emotional portion of the day. She had hired a real estate agent. She had told people at the memorial in my presence that the family would be selling the land and that I would be taken care of. She used those words, taken care of, like I was a problem to be managed rather than the person who had spent 8 years turning a dying ranch into something living. I let her finish. I did not interrupt, and I did not argue while she was talking. I waited until she was done, until the full weight of what she was planning had settled into the room around her, and then I stood up and said, "The ranch isn't yours to sell." My mother laughed. It was a laugh of someone who believes they are watching a child try to stand at the adult's table. She told me to sit down and not to make a scene. And then my lawyer stepped forward, the man I had called 2 days earlier and briefed completely, and he placed the deed on the table in front of her and explained, in language that was clear and that left no room for misinterpretation, that Earl had transferred ownership of the property to me 3 years ago, that every legal requirement had been properly met, that the property had been mine for 3 years and would continue to be mine, and that there was nothing to sell because there was. Nothing of Earl's left to settle. The silence in that room was something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. My mother's face went through several transformations very quickly. Disbelief and then fury, and then something that looked briefly like grief, though I think what she was grieving was not Earl but the plan. She said I had stolen it. She used that word, stolen, for land I had worked on for 8 years, land I had repaired and invested in and built a life on, land that a man who loved me had given me, because I was the only one who had ever really shown up for him. Sloane, with extraordinary timing, appeared to faint. No one looked at her. Not a single person in that room turned their head in her direction. My father tried to apologize, moving toward me with his hands open, but he would not leave my mother's side to do it, and an apology attached to her was not something I could use that I told him to leave. Not cruelly, not with the years of accumulated anger that I could feel sitting in my chest like a stone, but plainly and with complete certainty. I told my mother that she had said, years ago, that she could only show up for one of us at a time. I told her that Earl had shown up for me forever, and that she was holding the proof of it in her hands. I walked them out to the gate, and I watched them drive away down the road, and when their car disappeared around the bend, I just stood there for a minute and let the quiet come back. There were horses moving in the paddocks behind me, and the sound of Casey talking to one of them in the barn, and the smell of the grass and the turned earth, and the particular quality of the air in the early evening out here that I had come to think of as the smell of my life. I didn't cry. I had done enough crying for this family. I was done. That was a year ago. I haven't spoken to any of them since, and the silence has been among the most peaceable gifts I have ever given myself. Tom and I were married here at the ranch in the early spring, just as everything was starting to green up, with Casey and our neighbors and the people who had become our real community standing around us in the space Earl had always meant to be used for living. June, who is no longer the hollow-eyed, bone-showing creature who arrived here unable to believe in kindness, had a foal that spring, a small and steady-legged and boldly curious filly that I am keeping. I put Earl's gloves on every morning. They fit now, not because my hands have grown larger, but because I have grown into the person he always believed I was going to be. I understand now that blood is just biology. It makes you a relative and nothing more. Family is the people who show up for you, who choose you, who stay when the staying is hard, and who are there when you look out from the stage. I found mine out here, 3 hours east of everything I thought I was supposed to want. I set my boundary on a Saturday morning when I packed a bag and drove toward the only honest thing I knew. I worked the land until it was mine, and I finally have the life I always wanted.